Mr. President, good morning.
Good morning.
Pleasure to have you on our program. You have said that the collapse, the financial collapse in your country threatened your entire democratic and social system. How so?
It was an extraordinary experience to witness how the collapse of the banks, the financial crisis, seemed to be in the process of breaking up the very strong social cohesion which has characterized Iceland for centuries. In our country, this led to continuous protests in the streets, even at the height of winter, riots in front of the parliament and the prime minister's office. And from one day to another, as we came into January of 2009, what I feared every morning when I woke up was not that we wouldn't be able to deal with the economic consequences, but whether what was happening to our political and social and democratic system would completely split apart and we wouldn't be able to put it together again.
How far away from the collapse of that social cohesion you talk about do you think the country actually was?
Well, it's very difficult to say. We had the moment in the middle of the night in January where there was a big crowd outside the Prime Minister's office demonstrating, and the police was guarding the Prime Minister's office with shields and hamlets, and the crowd started throwing rocks at the police officers and the policemen. And then it seemed that perhaps the Prime Minister's office would be invaded. But then all of a sudden, a small group came out of the crowd of demonstrators and put themselves in front of the police force, so the stones that were being thrown would hit fellow protesters. And many of us believe that if these individuals, 15, 20 of them or so, had not at that moment decided that enough was enough, nobody could have predicted what would have happened during that night.
And nothing like this has ever happened in Iceland before?
No, never, ever. So, as I have said to many, both financial leaders and political leaders in other countries, what all of this demonstrated is that banks, financial institutions, those who operate in the financial markets, both nationally and globally, they carry an enormous political and democratic and social responsibility, because their actions on their own can break down our democratic and political system. So the theory, which was very popular from the 1980s onwards, so that somehow the market was supreme, and if you allowed the market to go ahead full force, the rest of society and our political system would somehow take care of itself. What we witnessed in Iceland, that this was turned on its head, that the failure in the market threatened the breakdown of our entire political and democratic system. And that is a very important lesson for those who have advocated the superiority of the market forces without taking into consideration the consequences that we are now witnessing. But fortunately for us in Iceland, we were wise enough somehow early on, perhaps due to these events that I have just described, to realize that this challenge, this crisis, was not just an economic crisis. It was also a fundamental political and social and democratic challenge.
Right.
And I think one of the reasons why many European countries, and perhaps even the United States and Britain, are still facing these enormous financial and economic challenges that we are now seeing every day, every week, every month, is that it's only very recently that the leaders of Europe and the United States have squarely faced it, that this is also a profound political and democratic challenge.
Mr. President, let's talk about the remedies that Iceland undertook. The economic orthodoxy of the day says that the standard prescription for economies in trouble facing the challenges that you did was severe austerity, slashing government spending, bailouts if necessary of the financial institutions. How much of that did Iceland in fact do, or did you reject all of that?
I think it is illustrative to perhaps divide the Icelandic response or the Icelandic way into three different dimensions. The first was what I have just described, that we defined the challenge not just as an economic challenge, but also as a profound political and social and democratic challenge. So we instigated various measures to deal with this political challenge. We established a commission to examine the failure of the banks, the corporations, and political institutions in our country. We appointed a special prosecutor's office, which became the largest judicial entity in our country. We even set in motion examination of our constitution, as well as various other legislative reforms that were enacted following the financial collapse. So the first dimension is to treat this as a profound challenge to society and the political system. The second dimension is that in various financial and economic measures we went, as you mentioned, against the prevailing orthodoxies. We, for example, did not pump public money into the banks. These were private banks, so we allowed them to fail. Those who had lent money to these banks had to take the responsibilities of having operated in the free market. We let our currency, the krona, be devaluated strongly. We instigated budgetary measures that tried to shield those who are the poorest or faced biggest difficulties because of their social status. And we enacted many other measures that were contrary to the traditional recommendations by experts or international institutions. And it was very interesting that at a recent Farewell conference that was held in Reykjavik, because the IMF program is over. IMF has now left Iceland because of the success of our recovery. The IMF leadership, which participated in this conference, acknowledged that dealing with Iceland had been a very interesting and fundamental learning process for the IMF.
But, Mr. President, the IMF at the time warned Iceland that you would never again be able to borrow if you didn't bail out the banks. And politicians in Europe said the same thing. The rating agencies demanded that the government honor the debts of the banks.
Well, all of this is true. With respect to the rating agencies, I have to tell you that I still think they have a lot to answer for, because when we look back at why we didn't take measures in 2006 and 2007 or early 2008, when some experts were warning us about the banking system, the rating agencies, all of them, Moody's, Standard & Poor and Fitch, all gave the Icelandic banks a clean bill of health, even an excellent certificate. So the fundamental question with respect to the rating agencies is that if they were so wrong in the years leading up to the banking crisis, why are they suddenly right now? But you are right. We did not follow these traditional measures that are in fact still these very days being pushed in various European countries. And that came out very squarely in what I call the third dimension of the Icelandic response. That in this very difficult dispute with Britain and the Netherlands, where they demanded that the people of Iceland should be formally responsible for the debt of a private Icelandic bank that operated in Britain and the Netherlands, I decided, following a strong national demand, to put that to a referendum, to let the democratic will of the people be superior to the financial interest of the market. And when I took that decision in the beginning of 2010, it went against